That was probably the most effective attack all week, but Michael Stutchbury surplus in 2 years, is it credible?
I think it could happen, Barry, but I think the issue is that Australia, as the budget sets out, and as Wayne Swan said, is at a 140-year high in our terms of trade thanks to our China boom. That is what the rest of the world is paying for our exports. It's never been higher for the past 140 years. This is about as good as it gets. And when the Prime Minister said that the terms of trade assumptions were very prudent and conservative, it is true that Treasury forecast a slight fall over the next couple of years. But I think we're really quite exposed. If anything goes wrong with the China story, anything seriously goes wrong with the sovereign debt crisis...
But why would anything go wrong with the China story?
The Governor of the Reserve Bank has warned that global imbalances are re-emerging, inflation pressures are re-emerging, and even if it doesn't go wrong over the next couple of years, it's more over the 2, 3, 4, 5-year horizon. There's a lot of scope for things to go wrong in the global economy. We've been incredibly lucky, Australia, getting through this crisis. We haven't really done any belt tightening, and we've really spent too much of our China boom too early. We should be in a big surplus now, not in a couple of years. And this means that if there is a downturn, we haven't built up any form of surplus fund in case of...
That's absolutely true, but of course this government was operating under constraints, a peculiar set of constraints, economic constraints that meant that a lot of the cuts that you might normally think about doing weren't really credible. When you've got an economy growing in some places and quite weak in other places, it does limit the cutting that you can do. And also, I mean, I think we have to take into consideration the political constraints. They couldn't afford another fight, and they couldn't afford a loss on the floor of the Parliament, and that really limited what they could do and how tough they could be. So, I mean, I guess I agree with you. Sure, in other circumstances, there could have been a lot more cuts in this budget, but under the circumstances, I sort of think they went in the right direction cautiously and probably for good reason.
And I also think, I'm not sure about this argument about the risk of collapse. I mean, if you read the budget papers, not so much about China, but the discussion about Europe in particular is quite gloomy. And it also factors in an exchange rate assumption of $1.07, which is just extraordinary when you think about it. Now, when you think about what $1.07 means to the non-resources economy, I mean, to me, the risks are all on the downside, but they're not necessarily just international risks. The risks are that with higher interest rates, the cautious consumer continues and becomes more cautious, that we start to really see a very savage readjustment in the non-resources economy from this high dollar and from the terms of trade. So I think all of those reasons make it very difficult to cut back harder. I mean, given that we're forecast to move from a $50 billion deficit to a surplus in 2 years, I mean, that's, as you know, Michael, that's a huge fiscal crunch just in terms of the way Treasury talks about it, which is, you know, the change in the level, which is what impact it has on the economy.
On the point about the minority government, it's true. This has come about because we have a weak minority government. It's also come about the squeeze on the non-resources sector, the higher interest rates and the higher dollar, are in part because structurally fiscal policy, budget policy is very loose. Now, this is not just the fault of this particular government. It means that in the first stage of our China boom, the Howard Costello budget, we spent a hell of a lot of that first stage of the boom. And this is typically what happens in resources booms.
And everything
when
that was put away was spent in the global financial crisis.
You spent up, and then when Rudd Labor came in, they didn't attack any of this, they didn't cut back. Then when the crisis came in, they spent too much, spent it too wastefully. So our structural deficit now is about, as Treasury says, it's not put in the it's not put in the budget papers, but our structural deficit is about 4% of GDP. We're quite exposed if something goes wrong. And it is true, the budget is mildly contractionary, but it's coming from a very loose budget position.
When they say that, it's, as Tony Abbott, it's a good line that he used during the week, it's a surplus made in China, is that a problem? Should we be concerned by that?
Where would he like it to be made? I mean, that is the reality
Where
of
were
things.
Peter Costello's surpluses made?
This is the reality. What's happened here is we've got this strange story now where we have got fiscal constraint. OK, a lot of people would say you could have more, but for the first time in many years, and it only happened, I think, once under Howard and and for several years under Paul Keating, you've actually got the government delivering a very small increase, 0.7% of GDP in the year just finishing, 0.5 is forecast for the coming year. The story is all about these huge swings in revenue. If we didn't have a surplus made in China, if you like, if we didn't have the global financial crisis, we'd have a completely different revenue story. The budget could be almost in balance this year, possibly in surplus next year.